Shayla and Ronald Trakes visited Paradise Lake, located in Utah, in the year of 1995. It was summertime, the middle of August. Shayla and Ronald were celebrating their second anniversary. Both were avid campers and hikers, so this was just their idea of a fantastic weekend. They arranged for a relative to stop in and feed their dog and fish. They stopped at Walmart and loaded up 2 coolers. One held drinks, both soft and those providing libation. Shayla was a wine drinker, and Ronald liked the occasional cold beer. Ronald wasn't what you would call a big drinker. In fact, he often had a cold one just because he was not a fan of kissing his wife, or anybody for that matter, when they had alcohol on their breath. Naturally, if he had also been drinking, then it was not a problem. He, of course, loved his wife, so having a cold beer before becoming intimate with her was not a high price to pay. Oftentimes, he would just have a drink or two and then pour the rest of the beer down the bathroom drain when she wasn't looking. He never wanted her to think he was drinking just for the sake of them being intimate. Shayla loved her husband as much as he loved her. Ronald was aware of that fact. If Shayla ever figured out his reason for having that beer before bed, it would cause her to give up her wine, and because she cares as much about him being happy as her, or as he her. Shayla was not in any way an alcoholic in Ronald's eyes. Yes, she had some wine nearly every night, but she was always pleasant, playful, and never showed any negative traits which are associated with drinking too much. However, you cared to compare them. At the end of the day, they matched up well. Ronald was a big believer in the approach, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. He would be the first to admit he was still new to the marriage game, but he wasn't new to knowing not to go looking for trouble. It is entirely possible she would quickly agree to change her habits. Ever hear of a dry drunk? Anybody who has spent time with one would tell you they are not somebody you want to find yourself married. No, he thought he would just stay with the approach of not fixing it. They had plenty of booze, enough food to have a couple of good cookouts, and the rest of the time they would be living on sandwiches. Ronald fashioned a way to carry both the coolers so they could keep them between them instead of each one of them having to carry one cooler by themselves. It was a simple plan where he took a length of garden hose that fit around the shoulders, and then he ran some line through it and ran the line through the cooler handles, and then it went to the other end doing the same thing. Another way to describe it would be when you make a handle to go on a bucket, the part of the handle where your hand would go is made much more comfortable if it is wrapped in tape, or if a piece of plastic is provided so the hand isn't holding an extremely narrow cord which could cut into the flesh. Instead of it has been taped in some manner as a baseball bat is done. Well, in this case, the tape was replaced with garden hose, which was perfect for keeping the carry-all from cutting into the person's back. Ronald had noted if they had some of those pool noodles, that they would have worked even better for providing a cushion for their backs, but the garden hose still was much better than nothing. Oh, there was one more thing they brought to their party. They also brought some Coke, not the sipping kind. Such recreational substance greatly cut down on one's appetite, so if anything, they had more food than would be needed. They met at the party, where there was plenty of it around. One thing led to another, which included a lot of talk, and they ended up watching the sun come up, all strung out and wishing they'd brought more booze, while checking their watches to see if they could legally go buy some more. They hit a quick stop on the way back to what ended up being his place. They chased away the Jones by staying wrapped up in each other, and it ended up being a once-in-a-month ritual for them. They couldn't afford to do it more often, in more ways than one. As long as they kept their shit together and didn't party more than once a month, they felt it was being about as responsible as, well, like Ronald said, as responsible as I want to be. There were the poster couple for the pro side of allowing recreational drugs, but at the same time, the same thing could have been said of countless couples to come before them who ended up sliding down that slippery slope. To be fair, however, they had not yet, therefore, proving that they were worthy of said privilege, or that is how many would have viewed it. Shayla was in agreement, though she likely would have went along with whatever Ronald said. But then again, a big part of the reason she loved him so much was because he had that responsible side while still holding on to his wild side. In truth, they weren't that wild. What they liked to do was to get some blow and find a place where they could bring groceries for the weekend and lock the door behind them so they could be free to frolic naked and just revel in the excitement and passion which some couples are lucky enough to share. Both parties were caring enough to always be interested in keeping things fresh, but they wanted to do it in a manner that didn't involve other people. Well, that wasn't quite true. Part of the fun of going on these campouts was the time they had to travel. Ronald was a real rascal because he would first get Shayla to take off her bra, and then when they would come upon someone who could not ever be any kind of a threat, which meant most often it was an over-the-road truck driver, he would have her flash the driver. It was harmless fun, which Ronald figured brightened up the truck driver's day, gave the missus a bit of a thrill, and at the end of the day nobody was any worse for the effort. That's all he was really doing, just having fun. Making two people get a little boost in the department we all can use a boost, and finally, it really elevated their time together once they got the car parked. When they arrived at Paradise Lake, they went to the northernmost part of the lake, and they set up the camp, so they were basically all by themselves. There was one other tent set up, but it was a good 3 or 4 football fields distance away, a sufficient distance to dampen any noises the couple expected to make. They had played around on their way to the lake, and Ronald had Shayla flash several truck drivers, whom all were quick to give a honk, followed by flashing their lights. He figured since it was daytime, they were flashing their lights just as an extra way to show appreciation. What he was certain about was that they were going to have a great weekend. As soon as they got the tent set up, he was going to roll around in there with her all naked until they were both all sweaty. Next, they'd cool off in the water before coming back to the tent, and then he'd fix them a couple of lines to keep them from being hungry while he got everything set up for cooking a nice-looking ribeyes that he had picked out, which had been marinating in his own special mixture of what basically amounted to salty garlic water mixed with apple cider vinegar, a touch of black pepper, cayenne pepper, paprika, and a touch of liquid smoke. Try it sometime. So all that done, it was time to get things ready for cooking supper. While Ronald got everything ready to cook his lady a great meal, she broke out her lawn chair and stretched out to get some sun. As he fussed around the grill cooking their food, it was hard not to take notice of the neighbor's tent, which, as mentioned, about 4 or 5 football fields away in distance. So far, Ronald had not seen any activity around the tent. Since it is just asking for somebody to swipe your stuff if you leave it, he found it funny that those who owned the tent were not ever in sight. He guessed it was possible they were in the tent sleeping, or doing what he and Shayla had been doing, but if so, the guy was making Ronald look bad. Who does he think he is, anyway? Sting? Ronald continued to keep an eye on the tent. The longer he watched, the closer he tried to view in hopes of seeing some kind of life signs. But no, there was nothing to indicate that there was anybody inside the tent. Another few hours and it would be completely dark. He couldn't imagine coming back to a tent in the dark. That just didn't seem appealing at all. Then he decided one thing was for certain. When it got dark, he would find out if there was anybody inside the tent. After all, who stays in their tent all afternoon and evening, allowing it to become dark outside without at least turning on a light inside the tent? Who would stay in a tent all that time and then choose to sleep through until the following morning? Well, nobody, that's who. So if he didn't see a light in the next few hours or an actual person, then it was likely there was nobody in the tent. Good thing to know, Ronald concluded. He figured if things got a little wilder than he had expected with Shayla, well, he would know that they didn't need to worry about how loud they got. They normally were tame enough that they would not even draw any attention, but always better to be prepared than to not. Sometimes they did do role-playing, and during those times, if Shayla's role called for her to be loud, she could get into character. Suddenly, Ronald picked up a hint of something unpleasant smelling. It was there, and then gone, but he definitely was sure the odor had been there. Thankfully, it was quickly replaced with the mouth-watering smoke coming off those ribeyes. He also had potatoes wrapped in foil and then shoved into the hot charcoal, which would result in the most fantastic-tasting baked potatoes. He just loved cooking them this way because they came out crispy on their skins, and he would eat the inside of the potato first and then butter up the skins and douse them with salt and pepper. He was thinking about those baked potatoes when once again his nose was offended by that unpleasant odor. This time it was around long enough for him to be able to describe it. First off, it reminded him of a pet store. The odor was quickly replaced with that of a wet dog, urine, and the odor of something that has been dead for a while. Pretty much the nastiest possible collection of odors found in nature. Talk about finding a way to ruin a guy's appetite. The odor hung around long enough for Shayla to notice it. However, about the time she started looking around, a breeze picked up and all that unpleasant smell went off into oblivion, leaving only the wonderful odor of those ribeyes coming to fast finish. Ronald pulled them off the heat and set them alongside of the grill so they would stay warm while not really cooking a whole lot more. The baked potatoes needed a little longer, so the two lovers went for a fast dip in the water, which was fantastic. They swam just long enough to really send their appetites soaring, which worked out perfect because the food was ready. They ate in the shadow of the top of a small mountain, or perhaps better described as an outcropping of rocky material. In any case, it towered over their tent, which Ronald had pitched at the base of, so as to have a natural windbreak. The dark shadow in which they ate their supper continued to creep over the entire campsite, and then it began to race across the lake like a heavy, dark comforter being pulled over white sheets until none of them were left showing. Ronald and Shayla retreated inside the tent. They turned on an LED light, which allowed Ronald to see so he could break out the Coke and cut them some lines. Meanwhile, Shayla was fixing them margaritas in plastic glasses, which she even had brought drink salt so to line the plastic glass rims. The two sat down in their tent and proceeded to do what people do on Coke. They chatted each other's ears off while downing drink after drink. Sometime about 3 hours after they had went inside the tent, they began to notice something was hitting on the outside of their tent. It was hitting lightly, but definitely hard enough the two noticed it was happening even while talking so much. The tent Ronald had brought did not have any windows in it. For the purpose he had intended, a tent with no windows was perfect. However, now it was requiring they exit the tent in order to see what was out there, causing what Ronald guessed were little pebbles to hit the tent. He had brought flashlights, one for each of them. There was a chance they might have found themselves out there alone, in which case they could strip down and chase each other around in the dark while naked. If they did that, it would require they both had a flashlight. So Ronald and Shayla both had flashlights, which they flipped on after exiting the tent. They searched the immediate area using their flashlights, which lit up maybe 20 feet before becoming lost to the darkness. Each of them surveyed the area but saw nothing. Then Ronald noticed there were a lot more small pebbles at the back of their tent as there were on the sides or in the front. It had been the back of the tent where they heard the noises. Something or someone had thrown those pebbles at the tent. Paranoia flooded in on them, like water running down the passenger window of a car driving in a hard rain. Ronald told Shayla to get inside the tent. She complied, and he followed right behind her. Once inside, they knelt next to the little makeshift table that they had made out of one of their coolers. Ronald picked up the small rectangle-shaped mirror that held their blow and inhaled a line. Next, he handed it to Shayla, who also did a line. Ronald pulled her close to him and said, "This is most definitely something or someone out there that's effing with us. I don't know if you saw, but there was a lot more little rocks at the back of the tent than on the sides that were in the front. It did not look natural." Shayla asked, "Are we in trouble?" "I doubt it. Most likely some kids just trying to freak us out. In any case, I have the gun for protection, so we will be okay. I just wish this wasn't happening on our anniversary." "It worked. I'm freaked out," she replied. "I'm wondering if we should go ahead and leave." Ronald replied, "It would probably put us at much more risk to walk all our stuff back to the car in the dark than if we just stay here." In the end, they decided to stay. At first, Ronald was quick to step outside whenever it sounded like something hit the back of the tent. He would survey the area with his flashlight and then go back inside the tent. After a while, they began to relax. The pebbles had stopped hitting the back of the tent. Eventually, Shayla put on some music, and the two did a couple more lines and began their chattering again. They enjoyed about 30 to 45 minutes of just chatting back and forth, talking about just everything under the sun. They downed a couple of drinks faster than they probably should have, but they were eager to put all the stress and anxiety which the darkness had brought behind them. Ronald suggested a strip and sip game which involves a pair of dice. It's basically craps, except doubles are an automatic strip of one article of clothing. When the clothes are all gone, they switch to trading articles of clothes for 2 minutes of whatever the other desired. The two were down to just their underwear remaining. Shayla lost her turn and was in the process of removing her bra when something pushed in on the side of the tent very violently. Both of them immediately shut up, and they could hear something breathing outside the tent. It had a deep, wet breath that reminded Ronald of the way a horse sounds when it breathes. They both moved to the far side of the small tent, the side furthest away from the side that had just been pushed inward. Then they could hear the thing moving around outside their tent. Ronald had a pistol he carried for protection, which he grabbed from the top of the cooler table. He quickly freed it from the holster. Then he and Shayla he had Shayla get behind him, and then they would go around in a circle, pointing the gun toward wherever they heard the thing outside moving around. Finally, Ronald got tired of the circling. He told Shayla to stay inside. Next, he stepped outside the tent and flashed the light around in a 360-degree circle, but he saw nothing. Ronald went back inside the tent, and basically the entire previously described scenario played out again, minus the strip and sip game. The two first were very cautious, just waiting for something to happen. After a while, they began to let down their guard. Eventually, Ronald cut them out some more coke, and they slowly began to forget about what had been outside the tent. They just chalked it up to some kids out messing around. Yes, they should have been run down and punished, but after all, these two were there to celebrate their anniversary. They had drinks, they had some blow, and he had his beautiful wife half naked with nothing to interfere with their fun. In the end, he did what every man would have done and pursued the booty he came there to chase. Screw those kids. Yes, he was angry, and he had every intention of approaching any kids he saw the next day and asking them about the matter. He didn't expect to get any confessions, but he thought if he let them see he was someone who was physically capable of taking care of himself, that maybe the little brats would not cause any more trouble for the coming night. Then it was back. Again, it pushed hard on the side of the tent, sending it whipping inwards toward the couple who were sitting in their spots. This time the thing quickly moved to the opposite side of the tent, pushing it in a violent manner. Ronald raced outside the tent with his pistol raised, ready to shoot, but again saw nothing. What was going on? He caught the whiff of an unpleasant odor. Then he went back inside, since the odor was not exactly a turn-on. Over the course of the next couple hours, the aforementioned happened yet again, and he would rush outside and flash the light in all directions, but never rewarded with anything but more darkness. Finally, Ronald devised a plan to catch who or whatever it was that was hassling them. If they were too quick for him to get a light on them, maybe he could do it by already having the light out there. He figured out he could rig the two flashlights into one that could be turned on from inside the tent using some line they had and the second flashlight. He took the spring out of the second flashlight and fixed it so it was basically an extension of the spring in the first flashlight. Normally, you had to push a button to get the light to come on. There wasn't any way to do that from a remote location, so Ronald fixed it so he could just tug on the line and it would bring into contact the extra spring to the part of the flashlight it needed to contact to turn on. He set the contraption up so that when it came on, it would be shining light on the tent, which should show the shadow outline of the kid's person or thing that was out there. Then Ronald planned to jump out of the tent and either scare the fear of Jesus back into the little jerks, or if it turned out to be an adult, he was considering shooting the SOB. If on the outside chance it turned out to be a bear or some wild animal, then he would shoot the damn thing dead, because enough is enough. His wife was nearly to a point of having PTSD from a night when they were supposed to be rolling around attacking each other. This was a part of him that felt certain this was not a bear or animal which would tease them to such a manner. People, especially kids, was another story altogether. Doing things in such a manner of a booby trap meant keeping the inside of the tent dark, because they wouldn't have the extra flashlight due to using that spring that was mentioned. Ronald planned on scaring the crap out of those kids, teaching them a lesson that hopefully he would cure them of such deviance. No bear would have acted in such manner. No animal of any species which he could think about would have acted in such a juvenile manner. The little brats were really lucky he hadn't shot his gun when they were circling the tent. They truly had no idea how close they came to getting shot. It was unbelievable. It was a circumstance demanding reaction. They had ruined this couple's anniversary celebration and nearly got themselves shot for their trouble. If they were his kids, he would see that they were severely punished. Of course, first he had to catch them. When Ronald finished setting up his trap, he moved back inside the tent. He had kept hold of the tent flap with his foot so he could find his way back in the darkness without using the line he had set up for turning on the light. If he used the line to find his way back, he risked messing up the very fragile arrangement he had for the light to come on. Just as he was entering the tent, he got a whiff of that dead odor he had noticed earlier before things got dark. He wondered, was this part of their little joke? Did they find something dead laying around and decide to set it upwind of their tent to further intimidate them? This whole situation was completely unacceptable. He considered that perhaps the coke had caused him to see the matter as more warped than it was, although his mind struggled to find an acceptable circumstance which might make things seem less evil than they appeared. When he entered the tent, he whispered for Shayla to reach out for him so he could locate her and then hold her. It was pitch dark. They used each other to traverse the dark. Together they waited inside the tent, Ronald holding onto that string he would use to spring their trap. While they waited, it occurred to him perhaps giving away their only two sources of light was not a good trade, but he had been so angry all he could think about was catching the little shits and taking his anger out on their parents. This was nothing short of terrorism. Well, they did not have to wait long. Keeping completely quiet, they stood together, holding each other while staring into the absolute black. This complete darkness was everywhere, with the only reminder they were near a lake being the split-second soft sound of the water giving way to a fish or an insect. Ronald didn't know if he had his eyelids open or shut. He tried them both ways and saw the very same thing. He couldn't imagine it being possible for anything to ever be darker. He held his gun ready to use. If things went sideways and he ended up having to shoot, and it turned out to be somebody's kids, well, they bought and paid for everything that was going to happen. It wasn't like he and Shayla went outside their tent looking to hurt anybody. If somebody came back, it was forcing them to protect themselves. They heard every slight wisp of a breeze. Standing in complete darkness after a while tends to make a person forget their surroundings and focus on their other senses, which are still able to perceive more than just an infinite amount of black. Ronald had time to start becoming lost in the scent from Shayla, even though he had intended to stay strong and focused. He was just starting to get really focused on her and that wonderful scent when there was a clear noise made just outside the tent. It brought him back to attention in the same manner a barking and aggressively acting dog wakes up a cat. It was coming from behind the tent. Ronald had set up the flashlight along the front corner of the tent, so the light, when turned on, would illuminate whatever was alongside the tent, and to some extent what might be toward the front of the tent. The circumstances were not perfect for springing the trap. Then they heard another distinct noise, but this wasn't what was most attention-getting detail of the moment. That odor was back, and it was much stronger. It was so bad and so strong that Ronald forgot all about scaring the crap out of the kids. Now he was just pissed off that they would drag something so foul up to his tent. He pulled on the string, causing the flashlight to light up the side area of the tent, and was headed out the front of the tent to give whoever a full bit of hell when Shayla grabbed his arm and forcibly, and instead of letting go of a scream she wanted to create, sheer instinct for survival prevented her from screaming, but she took out that extra energy by digging her nails forcibly deep into Ronald's forearm. Before he could let go an audible ouch, he was able to see the shadow outline of what had been teasing them all that night. First of all, it was freaking huge. The pistol he had held in his hand suddenly felt about as effective as if he was holding a squirt gun filled with perfume. He held his rant and charged to go outside the tent in trade for a more intelligent plan. Sometimes you have to accept the battle is lost in order to survive to fight the war later. A side note. Ronald had the presence of mind to remember the gun battle in the movie Scarface, most notably how Tony snorted a big handful of coke before going out to take on whatever was waiting. Well, he did not have any sort of urge to do that at all. Honestly, he was glad he had some of it because it kept him alert and he was ready to spring into action, but he wasn't going to be no Tony Scarface. He was also aware that it might be the drug was fooling him. Of course, that really didn't matter, did it? If that creature thing tried to come in the tent, he was going to have to fight it. The silhouette caused by the flashlight was only there a second or two before the connection causing the light to come on had been disconnected. They were back in the darkness. Ronald reeled his cord, but unfortunately it did not bring back the all-important spring they needed to make the remaining flashlight in their possession to work. That horrible odor had not gone anywhere. Then they began to hear something moving around their campsite again. It was now at the front of the tent, where the opening was located. Neither of them could see anything. Ronald whispered as quietly as possible to Shayla, "You need to get your body completely behind me, while being careful to not cause my arm or hand to be altered in any direction. I am pointing the gun, so when I fire it, there's a chance it will hit what we hope to hit. If you feel me twist my body like this," and he went so he was twisting to his right, "then you need to swing your body to your left." Again he whispered quietly but sternly so she would get it. "If I go to twist to my left, you need to go right." He twisted his body in that direction so she could feel what to expect. "Okay," Shayla said. Ronald was so proud of her. She had been the best possible partner to have through all of this. Not once did she scream. Not once had she broken down and fell apart, which might have been their difference of whether they survived that night. And now listen to her. "Okay," she says, like he had told her to switch the channel on the TV set. "You're the one who's okay, my dear. You're okay indeed." They continued to hear something moving around outside the tent, and then suddenly heard a loud bang sound, and Ronald realized he had left a food cooler out there in front of the tent. That banging sound was the lid being slammed back down on the cooler. Well, whatever was out there was having a buffet fit for a king at the moment. They heard a low growl. Ronald didn't know why he should think this way, but he thought that the growl was one of them telling another to get away from the food he just found. Or she. This was certainly no time to start any gender wars. He could honestly say he was just as terrified of what was out there, whether it was a he or a she. Shayla finally realized about the cooler, that it was what they had heard banging shut. She whispered to Ronald, "Maybe it will go away now. There's a lot of food in the cooler. It should satisfy whatever that thing came here seeking. Don't you think?" Ronald was in complete agreement. The only thing they needed was for the whatever was out there to come along to the same conclusion. After what seemed like about 20 minutes of total quiet, where they were listening to what was going on outside the tent, Ronald decided to risk speaking. By now he was pretty sure what was out there was not human, so he didn't think it could understand what he was saying. All the same, he tried to speak quietly. "I don't think that thing is going away. I also think there might be more than one out there. I don't know why they haven't tried to get into the tent, but I don't expect that to last through the night. I have an idea. Can you swim underwater for a distance and keep a fairly straight line?" Shayla whispered back, "Yes, you know I can swim underwater, and I'll do my best to make sure I stay in a straight line." "Okay," Ronald whispered back. "We're going to use the garden hose sections from the carrier and keep it in your shirt so you don't lose it. Next, we're each going to be carrying a bottle of whatever we happen to grab, and then we are going to bolt out of the tent and run straight forward, which will take us into the water. Now this is important. While we were covering that 5 or so steps from our tent to the edge of the lake, we were each going to throw our bottle off to the side from where we are actually at. We want the bottles to hit the water just ahead of ourselves, so if it chases us in the darkness and hears those bottles splash, it might draw them in that direction while we get into the water and under it. And that's where the garden hose comes into play. Use it like a snorkel. You'll have to use your hands to keep it bent in the right direction, or you can turn it upside down so you're facing the surface and draw air straight down the hose. Either way, the idea is to use the hose to keep from surfacing. We swim out and away from the beach and use the darkness to cloak our escape. By the way, feel around and see if you can locate that baggie with the goodies in it. We can use the baggie to keep my pistol dry in case we need to use it at some point. Got all that?" He could feel her shaking with fear. She still managed to sound calm when she replied, "I've got it." Then he whispered, "Feel around for your jeans so I can cut them into shorts using my knife." She did as he asked, and he felt around until he had one hand on the inside of her jeans, and then he proceeded to cut the jeans into shorts. Shayla fished around in the dark with her hand, trying to locate that baggie, while Ronald proceeded to cut the legs of her jeans into very thin strips, which he then tied end to end. When he was finished, he tied that onto the cord which ran inside the garden hose, which made their carrier for toting the coolers. Together, with the cord, he figured they had about 8 feet of jeans cord, which he went on to explain. When we hit the water, we will each have an end of this, so we can know where the other is at. If you get off path or me, the line will go tight and force us back into a more parallel swimming pattern. We keep heading straight out, away from where we enter the water. With any luck, or they will fall for the decoy splashes and give us enough time to get into and under the water. After you're under the water, try to use the garden hose so you don't have to surface to get air. The further out into the lake we get before our position is given away, the better chance we have of escaping that thing or things. And by the way, the first exhale into the garden hose should be done forcefully to get the water out of the hose. Shayla was in complete agreement. I think there might be more than one, too. I know we only saw the one when the flashlight lit things up, but based on that stench, I think there's more than one. You know, that thing looked like a freaking wolf man. Or so I thought. I know those ears were wolf-like. Ronald replied, "Whatever it or they may be, it seems there is some respect to the tent, or we'd have been compromised by now. They must be at least a fear we have a gun in here. As dark as it is tonight, I don't think even an animal that can see better than humans in the dark is going to have much of an advantage. When it comes to moving through darkness, there's only two ways, either by feel, whether that is by whiskers or hands. The point is they have to feel to know where you're there, or by smell. We can be followed by the darkness in our scent. Don't forget about eyesight. Better eyes in the dark are all about how they are able to use the light which is available." Ronald said, "Oh, I took that into consideration first. That's what I meant about animals with better night vision would not have all that much of an advantage tonight, because there's literally isn't any light at all to work with. I didn't even see any stars." "Maybe it's going to rain and we were unaware." Ronald agreed. "Yeah, it must be cloudy or we'd be able to see some stars." "I guess it doesn't really matter. We're still going to have to make a break for it. I don't really have a good feeling about making it through the night staying here." "Me either," he agreed again. "I think my idea will work. I feel very confident we will make it to the water. I'm a little worried about whether we can breathe through the garden hoses, but we should have a good head start by the time it is figured out that we are not where the first two splashes are heard. If you have trouble breathing through the hose, it will likely be because you are too deep. Come up to a more shallow position so your lungs don't have as much force keeping them from taking in the air. I figure they will figure if we make a break for it that we will split up to help ensure at least one of us gets away. Thus, if they hear the two splashes in opposite directions, they might think it is us having split up and that we're swimming for it in those directions. Meantime, we'll be under the water swimming straight out toward the middle of the lake. Once we get out there a ways, we can manage to avoid any attempts to swim after us. We just need to make sure we hang on to our connection lines I made out of your jeans." Shayla asked, "When do we try and make a break for the water?" Ronald replied, "We listen for its location. When we are sure that at least one of them is behind the tent, meaning it would have to go around the tent to reach us before we get into the water, is when I think exists our best chance for this idea to be successful." Shayla squeezed her hand to let him know she was in agreement. They spent the next 20 minutes just frozen inside the tent. Terrified, they listened intently while it sounded like there were two who were circling the tent. Every once in a while, they would get a growl. Ronald began to conclude by the way that they were moving that they were not seeing much better in the darkness. There was one time when he thought they had run into each other, but it was in the front of the tent, which was the direction they needed to go to make it to the water. He began to wonder why the creatures were not being more aggressive, and that was when he thought he heard them run into each other. Were they nearly as blind? Perhaps using their other senses to be able to move around the tent, but when one stopped for some reason, the other ran into it? So why would they be biding their time? Then it hit him like sunlight coming through the window after the blind is removed. They were waiting for the moon to make an appearance. Sure, it had started out a pitch dark night. Maybe the moon wasn't due to make an appearance until it got later. That made their taking in action more urgent than ever, since he didn't want to know what time the moon would appear. Ronald didn't share his conclusion with Shayla. He saw no reason for adding to her fears that they may soon run out of time. There was only one thing left to decide. He could shoot his gun as they bolted out of the tent, which should scare the creatures out there enough to buy them time to make it to the water. On the other hand, doing that sort of canceled out the effort of throwing the bottles as decoys, because if the creatures were recoiling from the gunshots, they're not going to be paying attention to where the first splashes happen in the water. In fact, it might work out that they miss the first splashes and therefore end up concentrating on the splashes he and Shayla make when they first got into the water. Plus, shooting the gun as they ran out into the water would mean he couldn't keep it inside the baggie where it would stay watertight, therefore ensuring it would fire when they came out of the water. Ronald had done a lot of practice and knew his weapon well, but he had never found out whether it would fire when wet. There are many stories about them not working. He didn't have a clue whether they would fire or not. So the conundrum was whether to use the gun to ensure their entry into the water, leaving them very vulnerable to exit, or vice versa. There was no in between. He was pretty sure he couldn't shoot the gun and get it into the baggie and get the damn thing sealed tight while racing into the water. Plus, the heat that the gun would have might be too much for the plastic and it might cause it to melt. He needed to decide whether to use the gun to escape or whether to use it to exit the lake. He thought the idea of using the bottles as decoys was a sound one. If they couldn't see any better than the humans could, then they were using their superior other senses to rely upon. Them hearing the splashes in opposite directions would surely sell the idea they had split up and were trying to swim in opposite directions to ensure one of them would escape. He decided to risk not using the gun while they were escaping. That way, if the moon did appear later and they were spotted from the shore and given no choice but to come ashore and fight, that they would have a chance. No gun meant no chance. Right now they had the cover of darkness and the decoys, which became mute the second the moon appeared. The gun remained a factor as long as it was able to fire. It might not be firing bullets big enough to kill one of these things, but he could sure ruin their day. He kissed Shayla and squeezed her hand. She continued to listen for their chance, and when a growl came from behind the tent, Ronald sent Shayla first, and he followed right behind. They raced through the darkness, and when Shayla's foot hit the moisture from the lake, she flung her bottle off to the side. Ronald did the same, and as the bottle splashed into the water, so did the two humans slip into the water as silently as possible, allowing themselves a last breath before completely going under. As they went under the water, they could hear something had run into the water on each side of their location, and it was splashing about. Ronald imagined it was the creatures had run into the water where they thought they had heard the humans had entered, and now they were splashing around in the water hoping to touch something so they could kill it. Immediately, both of them brought out their lengths of garden hose, which they managed to get above the water. Both were forced to exhale hard to push out the water that had caught in the hoses, but that was the only noise they made to give away their position. It was likely covered up by the splashing the creatures were doing. In complete darkness, that could have been literally anything making the water splash in such a fashion. As they swam under the water, they kept each other within distance because of the denim line that Ronald had fashioned out of Shayla's jeans. Eventually, the two surfaced and discussed their location in respect to where the shore was likely at and to where their parking lot was located. Ronald pulled them together using the line they shared. Then they became aware that there was a reflection coming off the water. The moon had indeed made an appearance. Ronald had chose wisely to get them out of there when he did. A minute later, and his eyes had adjusted enough so he could make out the shore. Anything beyond it or waiting along it, he could not see. They stayed in roughly the same spot for 5 minutes or longer, just taking in all they could, being they were in complete darkness. Then they caught a break. Apparently somebody had reason to leave the area at that late hour, because out of the darkness a car started up and its lights came on, announcing to anyone within sight the exact location of the parking lot they were seeking. They had managed to get the near perfect distance to be able to come out of the lake and reach their car with little extra effort required as far as the hiking went. And they immediately began to swim for the shore, but when they got to where their feet touched the bottom, Ronald held Shayla up for a second. He produced the gun, which he took out of the baggie. He then reached into it and gave some blow on his finger, which he snorted. Then he gave some to Shayla, a shot, They said if they were going to go out, it was going to be Scarface style. They walked out of the water and began the tedious task of locating their car in the darkness. Remember, they still had no source of light except the moonlight, which allowed them to see shapes, but it was their key fob that located the vehicle once they got near it. In the distance, they heard a howl, which brought goosebumps, even though the air was still plenty warm. The moon had now climbed to a height that would have been easily spotted by any animals which were blessed with night vision. They left the area without further incident, but it is something they will never forget, and they no longer go on campouts. Ronald springs for a motel room. On a side note, I'm reminded of a story about a couple who spent the night trapped in a rest stop bathroom. After they survived it, they split up because the guy's words said he thought that he reminded her of too much of that night and she just couldn't deal with it. I will try to include a link to that story, which should come up shortly. Thank you for your visit. Please subscribe. It is appreciated. Godspeed to all.